Chapter 16, The Recovery, Hanyu's POV. When Hanyu woke, the room was silent. Had Lord Antony left already? Hanyu squirmed free of his blankets and rolled into a sitting position, stretching luxuriously. He got to his feet, kicking his blankets back into place on his cot, then froze. Lord Antony was still on the bed. He had never slept later than Hanyu before, but there he lay, curled tightly in the fetal position, unmoving. Was he even breathing? After a moment, it became apparent that he wasn't, and Hanyu had a panicky hand outstretched to shake him when he remembered that the god didn't need to breathe and pulled back. Hanyu knew he shouldn't spy, but he'd never had the chance to see what his master looked like when he was sleeping before, and he couldn't help indulging himself. Lord Antony might have been sleeping, but he didn't seem very relaxed. His body was curled as tightly as a snail shell, and his lovely face was lined and worried, almost scowling. His pale hair fanned and tangled on the pillow, which none of his head actually rested on. He appeared to have migrated downward in his sleep. The marks of the vicious beating he'd taken last night had almost entirely faded, but only almost. His eye was still a little red and swollen, where Hanyu had assumed it would be blackened by now, and a few faint bruises still showed on his throat. Without the animating power and intelligence he radiated when awake, the god looked so impossibly small under the blankets. Hanyu felt a sudden powerful desire to hold him, to nestle into the sheets and curl his body protectively around Lord Antony and massage the worry lines out of his face with a gentle finger. Maybe his god would grumble a little in his sleep and uncurl, and then he would turn in Hanyu's arms and... Hanyu was still in the midst of this reverie when Lord Antony's eyes flicked open. "Dear me," he said, his voice a little lower and rougher than usual, but with no other signs of sleepiness. "Is it really so fascinating to watch me sleep? I should start charging admission." "My lord!" Hanyu felt his face flushing. The god stretched. "It's always a funny feeling to wake up and find a large, naked man staring at you." "I'm so sorry, my lord. I didn't..." Hanyu fumbled for a reasonable explanation, but quickly gave up. "Please forgive me." "Put on some trousers, and I'll consider it," Lord Antony replied. When Hanyu returned, the god was already dressed and standing by the bed, weaving his long silver sweep of hair into its accustomed braid. He looked perfectly put together, and Hanyu couldn't help wondering how much of what he'd seen last night had been his own imagination. He moved to where his master was standing and bowed. "I really am sorry for staring, my lord," he said sheepishly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't." Lord Antony's voice was bright, almost cheerful. "I'm not annoyed with you, pet. Don't give it another thought." Hanyu hadn't been pet since the night of the battle, and the endearment gave him the courage to spit out the rest of what he had to say. "My lord, I know you were tired last night and didn't wish to trouble yourself," he said carefully, "and I won't disobey you by requesting a punishment, but I do want you to know that if you're ready to discipline me for my breach of protocol last night, I'm ready to accept it." Oh, when you said my name?" Lord Antony sighed. "Get up, Hanyu. Look at me." Hanyu complied, ashamed to find that his hands were shaking a little. He knotted them together and stuffed them in his lap to hide the tremor as he looked up and met the god's eyes. Lord Antony looked steadily back, crouching down so their gazes were level. As he settled into the crouch, he winced and switched to a kneeling position, making himself shorter than Hanyu again. "I'm not angry, and I'm not going to punish you," the god said. "Honestly, I'm not even bothered. If you want to call me Antony when we're alone here in my rooms, I don't mind." Hanyu goggled at his master, who shrugged. "Obviously you can't do it when anyone else is around. I really would have to punish you for that, but it would be for their benefit, not because of any actual offense on my part. And if you prefer to keep calling me by titles, that's your own affair, but I'm hardly going to get offended by the sound of my own name. I've had plenty of time to get used to it, after all." "Really?" The thought made Hanyu very nervous. "But it seems so disrespectful." "Like I said, you don't have to call me by my name if you don't want to. What I'm telling you is that I don't care." The god smiled at him. "I know you respect me, Hanyu. Why should I care about titles and bowing?" "The bowing, too?" Hanyu blurted. Lord Antony shrugged again. "Naturally. If anyone is present or the door is open, then of course you need to bow. Otherwise, I couldn't care less. Do whatever you want." "All right." Hanyu would have to mull this over. "Thank you, my lord." "That's settled, then." Lord Antony got to his feet and looked down at him. I imagine we slept through the attendant coming to take you up for some sun. Ordinarily, I'd let you go up to the deck on your own, but today I'd rather you didn't." "That's fine, my lord," Hanyu replied. The title slipped so easily off his tongue. Was it worth the hassle to discard it? "I'd rather stay here with you today, if you please." "All right," the god agreed. He did look a little pleased. "Well, I'm afraid we slept through your breakfast as well. Let's go to the kitchens and see what they can give us." "Are you sure, my lord?" Hanyu felt suddenly self-conscious. "I don't want to put you to any trouble." "For goodness sakes, boy, how many times do I have to tell you a thing?" Lord Antony groaned. "I want you to be fed. I don't want you to go out alone today. We've been over both those things, yes?" "Yes, of course." Hanyu ducked his head and blushed. "Sorry, my lord." "Come on, then." The god turned and headed for the door, and Hanyu scrambled to his feet and rushed to catch up. Lord Antony was acting strange. His cheerful demeanor felt almost more dangerous than his rage the night before or his strangeness after the battle. It was a brittle pleasantness, and he shoved through the door as if he was pushing through a patch of thorns. Lord Antony didn't run once they were in the hallway, but he looked as though he wanted to. His shoulders were too relaxed, his gait too loose. His gaze flicked to one door in particular as they approached, then past it. Once they were past, Hanyu could almost feel him struggling against the urge to look back over his shoulder. Was that Lord Marcus's door? Was his master worried that their rough love-making hadn't quite been enough to soothe his lover's feelings? Or did he wish he could go in and make up with the war god some more, if only he wasn't saddled with the feeding of a useless human offering? Lord Antony seemed to relax a little, genuinely this time, as they went on. By the time they reached the galley, Hanyu was relaxing too. When they walked through the door, Hanyu was greeted by an overwhelming rush of heat and smells. Smoke, herbs, bread, meat. He was suddenly overwhelmingly aware of his missed breakfast. His stomach gave an embarrassing roar that made Lord Antony glance back at him, clearly amused. There were 6 men working in the galley. They looked tired, and none seemed younger than 40. One of them was loading stiff, dark bundles into an enormous stove, and when he looked up, he caught sight of Hanyu and his master. The man's eyes widened. "My Lord Antony!" he cried, clearly signaling their visitor's identity to the rest of the kitchen workers, and then he dropped into a bow so perfect that it caught Hanyu by surprise. The others looked up from their labors and followed suit. "Rise," Lord Antony said casually. "We're not here to interrupt your work. My attendant and I missed the delivery of his breakfast this morning, so I wanted something for him to eat." "Of course, my lord," one of the men said nervously. "We'd be honored to deliver some—" "Please don't trouble yourselves," Hanyu blurted. "I could just have some bread or something, whatever you have on hand." "Don't be ridiculous," Lord Antony snapped. "I drank from you last night. You need something hearty." "Would eggs suffice, my lord?" the man ventured. The god glanced over at Hanyu. "Certainly, as long as one remembers that swallowing is the step that follows chewing." Hanyu laughed. "I'll try to remember, my lord." Was his master teasing him? The statement had lacked any bite, so it didn't seem like a true reprimand. Instead, it felt like a sow ribbing him about the time Hanyu set his robe on fire. Hanyu found himself grinning down at Lord Antony, feeling warm and full all through his body despite his hunger. "Good," the god told the galley workers. "See to it. Come, Hanyu." It felt rather anticlimactic to turn right around and head back to their own chambers, but Hanyu didn't really mind. He liked walking with Lord Antony and having others see him in his master's company. It made him feel like they were truly together in some way, connected. The god tensed up again as they walked past all the doors. Hanyu had been walking 2 steps behind him, as protocol required, but the tightness in Lord Antony's shoulders sent a pang through him, and he dared to pull forward until they were walking level with one another. The god didn't scold him, and Hanyu continued to keep step with him. Suddenly, a door swung open with a soft squeak of badly oiled hinges. Before Hanyu could even register the motion, Lord Antony had put out an arm and swept it back, knocking Hanyu behind him with that divine strength that his offering so often forgot he possessed. A tall woman with skin even darker than Lord Antony's and the tapered ears of a god stepped out of the room. She smiled coolly when she saw them and dipped her head. "Hello, Lord Antony," she greeted. "Julia," his master replied, relaxing. Hanyu bowed deeply. The Lord Antony's hand reached up to touch his shoulder and prevented him from kneeling as he would have done. The god, Lord Julia apparently, shut her door and moved past them. Lord Antony sighed. "Come on," he said heavily, and they made their way back to their chambers in silence. Once they were through the door, the god truly relaxed. He rolled his shoulders and stretched luxuriously. "That's better," he said. The same overly bright cheer was back in his voice. "I don't imagine you'll have to wait long for your meal." Hanyu's stomach rumbled again, and he blushed. "That's true. Thank you for your trouble. You're kind to think of me, and... Why couldn't he force the word out? He blurted it out without a thought last night, but now it seemed like some powerful force was pressing on his lips and keeping the god's name behind them. He looked down, self-conscious. "For goodness sakes, boy, don't hurt yourself," Lord Antony said. "Don't call me anything if it's such a strain." The god disappeared into the bedchamber. Hanyu wanted to follow, but he hadn't had the chance to wash up yet, so he went to his own closet of a washroom and used last night's water, wondering whether the kitchen would send him a fresh pitcher with his belated breakfast. The salt water stung his eyes and left the skin of his face feeling a little stiff, but it was still so good to slough away the night's sweat. When the knock finally came, Hanyu sprang for the door with the enthusiasm of a lover. The man who had been feeding the fire stood in the hall, holding a tray and glancing nervously around himself. "Thank you so much," Hanyu cried, feeling almost teary with gratitude at the sight of the fluffy yellow pile of eggs. "This was so kind of you." "Lord Antony's never taken such an interest in an offering before," the man replied, looking Hanyu over with a rather uncomplimentary air of confusion. "We're happy to help you in any way you need. Lord Felix and Lord Julia each keep a stock of healing unguents should you need them." "Oh?" Hanyu's mind flashed to Lord Antony's injuries, the way he had hissed in pain when he tried to crouch down, and suddenly he understood. He felt himself flush. "Oh, no, thank you, nothing like that." "Of course." The man looked at him pityingly. "Well, ask around if anything changes." When Hanyu shut the door and turned to the table with his tray, he found Lord Antony already sitting there, looking amused. "My lord," he sputtered, flushing more deeply. Damn. If he'd known the god was listening, he'd have tried to make his denial smoother, more seductive. "Sadly, my lord has not yet granted me the honor of his bed, but I eagerly await the day I'll be able to avail myself of your kind offer." Would that have been too much? Maybe. If he tweaked the end a bit... "Come on, pet, eat your food," Lord Antony ordered, and Hanyu shook himself from his pointless rehashing and wriggled obediently into his seat. "I thought we might start another painting today, if you swear to tell me when you need to piss or eat," the god said, as Hanyu began shoveling eggs into his mouth. He was so hungry it was difficult to eat politely, but he was determined to make a better showing with these eggs than their predecessors. "Do you still have that gold robe you were wearing when I returned from the battle?" Lord Antony asked. "That would look very fine in a painting." "Of course, my lord." Hanyu spooned up another heaping bite of eggs, then hesitated before putting it in his mouth. "Should I do my makeup the same way too?" "Yes, if you like," the god replied. "You should definitely use that gold powder on your eyes again. That was lovely." "Of course." Hanyu smiled around his bite. So, he was still lovely. Once Hanyu finished eating, he changed into the required robe and did his makeup. He came out to find Lord Antony setting up his easel. His god looked up at him and frowned. "Aren't you going to do anything with your hair?" he asked. Hanyu put his hand up to the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious. He'd caught his hair up in the same gold net as before. "Does it look bad?" he asked plaintively. "Not in the least," his master replied. "But it's a waste not to do anything with all that hair. Here, go fetch a comb." When Hanyu returned with his comb, the god was sitting on the sofa with a selection of glittering, jeweled hairpins laid out on the cushion beside him. He looked up at Hanyu, then gestured to a large pillow that he'd set on the floor at his feet. "Sit down," he ordered, and Hanyu obeyed. Once he was settled at his master's feet, Lord Antony pulled the net from his hair with careful fingers. These same fingers then plucked the comb from Hanyu's hands and set to work. Hanyu couldn't believe how good it felt to have the god combing his hair. He'd never known that the scalp could be an erogenous zone, or that he could feel so aroused and so soothed both at once. Lord Antony was quick and skilled, but careful, so that the light tugging was never very painful. Hanyu tried to hold himself stiffly upright at first, but before long he found himself sagging bonelessly against the god's knees. "You must be very proud of your hair," Lord Antony said as he pulled the comb slowly through the soft strands. There was a quick, sharp tug as the comb's teeth found a knot, and the god stopped pulling and began working at the tangle with his fingers. "Not really," Hanyu said dreamily. "I got teased for it a lot when I was little. The priests always said that it was an asset and the gods would find it pleasing, but the other children thought it looked strange and ugly." "Ugly?" The god sounded personally affronted. "That's preposterous!" "Thank you, my lord." Hanyu smiled and closed his eyes to better enjoy the sensations. With the snarl conquered, the god returned to his combing. I don't see why you would believe a bunch of snot-nosed miscreants over the priests, Lord Antony grumbled. Hanyu shrugged. You know how it is at that age. The other children matter a whole lot more than a bunch of boring grown-ups. Is that so? The god sounded fascinated. But the adults have more position and experience, so it would be reasonable to care more for their opinions. Hanyu couldn't help laughing at that. Lord Antony sounded almost naive, which is almost certainly blasphemy, but it was also strangely endearing. That would be more reasonable, my lord, but you know perfectly well that people aren't reasonable, and children are even less so, he said, once his giggles had died away. The god hummed, his voice soft and far away. I had forgotten. It's been so many hundreds of years since I spoke with a child. They sat quietly for a moment as Hanyu got the courage up to ask the question that was burning in his brain. Finally, as the god set down the comb and began separating his hair into little strands, he decided to just spit it out. Were you ever a child, my lord? He asked. Lord Antony chuffed a little in surprise. Of course I was a child, boy. Don't be ridiculous. I wasn't sure, Hanyu defended himself. You don't breathe or relieve yourself. How should I know what you do? I suppose that's fair. The god worked quietly for a moment. Yes, I was a child, but it was an extremely long time ago. What were you like? Hanyu couldn't contain his curiosity. Would the child Antony have been clever and sarcastic like he was now? His briskness and easy authority seemed like traits that no child could possess, but perhaps he had. Or had he been something else entirely? Had he been rash, or silly, or lazy, or prone to losing his temper? Had the passage of such incomprehensible amounts of time changed him into someone entirely unrecognizable as the child he once was? I hardly even remember, the god said, and he sounded so sad that Hanyu wished he hadn't asked. I think I was well behaved. I had Theo, and I loved her and my mother and my twin sister and little brother more than anything. Our courtyard was the happiest place I could imagine. It still is, I suppose. He sank into silence, and Hanyu didn't dare speak and disturb him. His mind, however, was racing. Lord Antony and Lord Claudia were twins? He hadn't known that. He had also never thought of the three gods having a mother. They were widely believed to be some kind of night deities. Was their mother the moon? Were they unable to return to her? What about you? Lord Antony's voice sounded stronger, more like his usual confident tones. What kind of child were you? I was terrible, Hanyu laughed. Just like now, I suppose. You're not terrible. The god tapped his head with a single finger in gentle reproof. He sounded indignant, almost scandalized, despite the careful gentleness of the tap. I'm enjoying talking with you more than I have enjoyed anything in a very long time, and if your talk has showed anything, it's that you aren't terrible. You are extremely kind, which is not a quality I see much of anymore. I'm sure you are a good child. Hanyu sat frozen, astounded by the god's words. He felt tears prickling his eyes, and he felt a sudden urge to turn his head and press a gentle, grateful kiss to the hands working in his hair. He fought it down, determined not to disrupt his master's work. You must have had a lot of friends, even if they teased you, Lord Antony prompted. Hanyu swallowed and did his best to restrain his tears. I did. Asao and I were best friends from the beginning, I think, but our whole cadre was always close. We did everything together. And I'm sorry to contradict you, my lord, but I really was terrible. I cried about everything, even good things. I talked all the time. I never thought before saying or doing anything. I used to get distracted in our lessons and start drawing something or talking to the children around me, or else I would just pretend I had to piss so they would let me get up and move around. You're like that now, and it isn't terrible. Hanyu laughed a little shakily as tears continued to threaten. The priests would disagree with you there. Wouldn't that be blasphemy? Lord Antony mused. If only Asao was here, we could ask him, Hanyu replied, and was surprised by the sudden stiffening of the god's fingers in his hair. Yes, Lord Antony said carefully. What did you do besides lessons? We ran around the temple and caused trouble, of course, Hanyu replied. We would play games in the courtyards, try to raid the pantries, sneak into the older boys' rooms and try on their clothes and makeup, read adventure books, climb trees. Oh! Lord Antony gasped and pulled a strand of hair sharply, probably more sharply than he'd intended to do. Climbing trees! I forgot about climbing trees. I used to do that too. Mother had a chestnut tree in our courtyard, and we used to swarm up it and shake down the nuts. They were such a lovely glossy brown, they almost glowed in the sun once the spines were off. Your eyes are rather like them, now that I think about it. Hanyu felt his face flush and his whole body loosen happily at the compliment. He leaned further into the god's touch. "You're spoiling me today, my lord," he sighed. "No one's ever what? Paid him so many compliments?" He'd had compliments, though never from someone with so little reason to lie or flatter him. Perhaps it was simply the matter-of-fact, almost annoyed way the god listed his virtues or praised his beauty, as if Hanyu's good points were evident to all the world and he was simply being deliberately blind to them himself. Perhaps it was the fact that Lord Antony was so indignant when Hanyu called himself terrible. Perhaps it was his gentle fingers in Hanyu's hair. Perhaps it was all those things. Regardless, Hanyu had never felt so cared for in his entire life. "You're mine," the god replied. "I can spoil you if I want. Anyhow, this is pleasant. I find your company soothing today." Hanyu was on the brink of asking what a powerful, immortal god like his master could possibly need to be soothed from. Then he remembered the abrasions on his wrists and the way he flinched when he shifted position. Hanyu swallowed the foolish question and let the god continue his work. After a moment, the fingers withdrew and there was a cool touch of metal sliding against Hanyu's scalp. "Stand up and let me see you, pet," Lord Antony instructed. When Hanyu obeyed, the god smiled his small, reluctant smile, clearly pleased. "You look perfect," he said, and Hanyu flushed and grinned and fought the impulse to duck his head, instead lifting his chin to show off his face better. After all, his master thought he was lovely and good and nice to talk with, and he really ought to start acting like it. Lord Antony's smile broadened. "May I go look at it?" Hanyu asked. Lord Antony waved him off, and he hurried to the god's washroom. In the mirror, he couldn't see all of his new hairstyle, no matter how he twisted his body and craned his neck. It wasn't like the beautification rooms at the temple, where every wall was lined with mirrors so the offerings could critique and perfect themselves from every angle. After a moment of Hanyu's futile turning and peering, Lord Antony padded into the room. "I can't see it, my lord," Hanyu whined. "Of course you can't see it like this," the god replied. "Do you have a mirror in your washroom?" "Oh," Hanyu felt foolish. "I do, yes." "Well, go get it," his master instructed, and Hanyu obeyed. When he returned with the little hand mirror, the god extended a hand and he surrendered it. "Now you need to stand with your back to the mirror," Lord Antony told him. As soon as Hanyu was in position, the god lifted the smaller mirror up in front of his face. He peered into the little frame and finally saw what his master had been doing all this time. Lord Antony had pulled some of Hanyu's hair into small, tight braids, then woven those braids into larger, looser braids that came together in the middle of his head and fell down his neck. The rest of his hair was left to tumble free underneath the arrangement, and at the top of it all Lord Antony had stuck in a glittering hairpin made of gold and set with jewels, fashioned to look like stalks of wheat caught in a sheath. "I love it!" Hanyu cried. "Thank you, my lord." "Fine hair deserves attention," the god said dismissively. Then he hesitated, and his eyes lifted to meet Hanyu's. "It was pleasant to do. We should do it again soon." "I'm yours, my lord, hair included," Hanyu said, smiling at him. The longer he belonged to Lord Antony, the more he liked the thought. "You can do with me as you like." The god flinched a little at the words. Hanyu couldn't think why the plain truth would make him uncomfortable, but Lord Antony was in a strange mood today. He didn't mind. It was a soft, gentle mood, a mood in which he wanted to talk with Hanyu and touch him and compliment him and make him feel good, so as far as Hanyu was concerned, this was proving to be an excellent day.